former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Democrats triple down on hypocrisy. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. As Democrats slam President Trump for stoking riots in the streets, three of the nation's most powerful Democrats are exposed for rank hypocrisy. We'll play for you the flagrantly disingenuous or incendiary comments of the Democratic presidential nominee, the Speaker of the House, and the Governor of New York, all revealing exactly the type of hypocrisy and doublespeak that people hate about politicians. LibertyNation.com's Mark Angelides will join us to provide perspective on this time of trial for the nation and how the world is reacting to the breakdown of law and order in the streets of America. Plus, unbeknownst to many, there's a whole lot more on the ballot this year than just a race for president. Hundreds of congressional races are also on the docket, and we'll be joined by the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in Virginia, Daniel Gade. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs director Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. With President Trump hammering away at Joe Biden day after day following a widely praised Republican National Convention, the Democrat nominee has seen his large lead start to dwindle, particularly in the battleground states which will ultimately decide the election. So Biden went to Pittsburgh, in the key swing state of Pennsylvania, and made a speech in a warehouse before a crowd of, wait for it, 5 people, all members of the media, none of whom were allowed to ask questions. Biden started with a transparent attempt to lay blame for the widespread violence in cities all run by Democrats at the feet of Donald Trump.
This is a sitting president of the United States of America. He's supposed to be protecting this country, but instead he's rooting for chaos and violence. The simple truth is, Donald Trump failed to protect America. So now he's trying to scare America.
So let's do a hypocrisy check on that. Democrats did not even mention the chaos in the streets at their convention after allowing the riots to continue unabated for months. Trump did about the only thing he could do, offered to send in the National Guard, but was largely refused, except when the damage had already been done, the property and businesses already destroyed, so many lives already ruined. And now Biden and the left say it was Trump supporters who were causing the destruction. Nice try. But when it comes to doublespeak and an absence of principle, Biden was just getting warmed up. Pennsylvania is an energy state, a top producer of fossil fuels, and a boon to their economy in recent years has been fracking, a revolutionary drilling technique developed over the last decade or so. Biden said this week that he was not against fracking, but then listened to multiple comments stating the opposite in recent months.
I am not banning fracking. Let me say that again. I am not banning fracking, no matter how many times Donald Trump lies about me. No new fracking.
We are going to get rid of fossil fuels.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends.
As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes.
That is what lawyers call prima facie evidence of rank hypocrisy, or political doublespeak, if you will. But perhaps the most remarkable takeaway from that is the incompetence of the Biden campaign. How could they let their candidate go out there and reverse a position that he stated that many times on camera? How they could do that is literally breathtaking. Political malpractice at the highest level, and proof that Joe Biden will say anything, change any position, support any trending cause for the sake of political expediency. He's presenting as a politician empty at his core. But then there's the woman who's actually the most powerful Democrat in the nation right now, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, moralizing about her deep concern for COVID victims, trashing the president and his supporters for the spread of COVID and not wearing masks, was caught on camera getting her hair done without a mask, while the regular citizens of her district are restricted from doing the same. But that's not even the worst part. Listen to the way Pelosi issued an apology while signaling her own innocence.
I take responsibility for trusting the word of a neighborhood salon that I've been to over the years many times, and that when they said, well, we're able to accommodate people one person at a time, and that we can set up that time, I trusted that. As it turns out, it was a setup. So I take responsibility for falling for a setup.
I don't even need to explain the hypocrisy and doublespeak there. But let's complete the trilogy of Democratic hypocrisy with Democrats far and wide blaming Trump for inciting the violence in the streets, belying the fact that every riot-torn city has been run by Democrats, usually for decades, one of, if not the, most powerful governor in the country, Andrew Cuomo of New York, responded to Trump's statement that he'd consider cutting federal funding to states who refuse to control their mobs by publicly threatening the President of the United States if he ever sets foot in New York again.
He can't come back to New York. He can't. He's going to walk down the street in New York. Forget bodyguards. He better have an army if he thinks he's going to walk down the street in New York.
So this is what it's come to. The governor of the second largest state in the nation publicly threatening the President of the United States. A civil war is on, in words at least, and increasingly in deeds. But the left is not limiting their strategy to fighting words against Trump. They're also trying to convince their supporters not to believe their lying eyes, even as they seem to concede that Biden will appear to lose the election. I know, makes no sense to me either, but listen to this narrative concocted by the online site Axios and Bloomberg News, a red mirage.
The reason we talk about a red mirage is, in fact, because we believe that on election night, we are going to see Donald Trump in a stronger position than the reality actually is. The data is going to show on election night an incredible victory for Donald Trump. That is likely to be what we see when every legitimate vote is tallied and we get to that final day, which will be someday after election day. It will, in fact, show that what happened on election night was exactly that, a mirage. It looked like Donald Trump was in the lead, and he fundamentally was not when every ballot gets counted.
Why should I listen to you?
In most every year, Democrats are more likely to vote by mail than Republicans, and that has only increased this cycle.
What does it say that Democrats vote by mail about 3.5 times as much as Republicans? But the takeaway here is that no matter the outcome, Joe Biden is being instructed by various forces on the left to never concede, because Democrats might be able to find enough votes among the mail-ins to flip things after Election Day. The fact that Axios, which tries to tout itself as above partisanship, is openly promoting a scheme based on wild speculation, is further evidence that the media is supporting the Democratic candidate more openly and audacious than ever. That is the Trump effect. But the issue of Black Lives Matter has started to turn as popular support for the avowedly Marxist group is cratering, and black Trump supporters are starting to show themselves, as demonstrated by a group of black men who confronted Black Lives Matter protesters.
He wanted to talk some nonsense about where this country really is, that it's stolen land. I asked him, well, then who do we give it back to? He had no answer, which most of their arguments have no answer. If you're going to build something, you get a job so you can put your taxes back into your city. That's called building something. Or start your own business. That's what this country's about. It's not about getting some kind of like minimum wage job that you hope pays for your life. It's about you getting out there and making your own way.
Trying to get them to understand, like, just at first answer the question, because we would give him a question for him to answer, because Donald Trump is racist. Well, how's he racist? That's it.
The protesters have no answers because they want to tear down the system first and figure out what to replace it with when everything collapses. Stay right there, because when we return, we'll discuss how congressional candidates are campaigning in this time of crisis as we meet and greet the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in Virginia.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, we're also caught up in the ongoing threat of COVID-19, the outbreak of widespread urban violence, and now the presidential race, that it's easy to forget that there are no less than 470 congressional seats also being contested on November 3rd, including 35 in the U.S. Senate. So how are Senate candidates approaching the election in this year like no other? To what extent are Republicans tying themselves to the president and Democrats basing their campaigns on hatred of Trump as opposed to forging their own identities apart from the candidates at the top of the ticket? Well, having made a run at the U.S. Senate myself a few years ago, I can relate to the man who joins us now. Daniel Gade is the Republican nominee for the 2020 U.S. Senate seat in Virginia, trying to unseat incumbent Democrat Mark Warner. He's 45 years old, West Point graduate, and during 20 years active duty in the U.S. Army, Lieutenant Colonel Gade was awarded the Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. And he joins us now. Mr. Gade, Lieutenant Colonel Gade, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
In this long, strange trip that 2020 has been, you certainly know hardship and pain and overcoming it. You've come all the way back from a horrific episode in Ramadi during the Iraq War 15 years ago, which left you without a right leg. How did the long, painful journey back to health change you? And did it animate your own decision to go into politics?
Well, Tim, my recovery after those combat wounds is not my being combat wounded is not a qualification for high office. But I hope what people see when they look at me and they examine my life story is that I have lived a life of grit and determination. And I'll take that same grit and determination to the United States Senate after I'm elected.
Now, when you first decided to run for the Senate, things were very different. No pandemic, no insurrection in cities across the land. So how's your campaign changed in light of these plagues on the land?
Well, you're right. It is a plague, and 2020 has been a pretty major disappointment, I think, in a lot of ways for most Americans, and really painful for some. But, you know, this is my first run. I'm not a career politician like Mark Warner is, and so it's I don't know any different, frankly. And what we're doing here is we're just reaching the people. We're doing it by Facebook, and we're doing it by Twitter, and we're doing some in-person events, actually. And the reason we're doing that is because this is a job interview, and it's really important for the people to be able to see those folks who want the job.
To what extent are you tying your own campaign to President Trump or not? Because Virginia's not exactly Trump country.
Well, right. You know, Tim, as you know from your work in promoting liberty and your work in examining the Federalist Papers, the Senate and the Congress more broadly are a separate and co-equal branch of government. So my message to Republicans, Independents, and Democrats is that if you elect me, you're electing a career servant, and I am loyal to the Constitution and loyal to the American people. I'm not loyal necessarily to my party, and my term in the Senate will go past President Trump's term. So when he's right, I'll absolutely back him 100%. And if he's wrong, I will tell him to his face, Mr. President, you're wrong. You need to do something else here. And I think that that's the approach that any senator owes his party, and not the unflinching loyalty that somebody like Mark Warner gives to his Democrat Party.
What are the starkest contrasts to the incumbent Mark Warner that you're drawing in the campaign?
Well, you know, the starkest contrast of all of them is that that he is a career politician. He's a career swamp creature. That's all he's ever done. Literally, when he went to college, he said one time that he had gone to college to major in Washington, D.C. So that's who he is, and you see it in his behavior because who he is he votes with his party, 90+% of the time. He's never been the deciding vote on any important legislation against his party. And so you've got this guy who's a rubber stamp for an increasingly far left Democrat Party. And then when you look at me, you've got somebody who's set aside his life, who has served at risk of life, and who is a rubber stamp for nothing but the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you for your service.
You are absolutely welcome.
That is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade, Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in Virginia. Stay right there, because when we return, we'll offer up some perspective and reaction across the world to the breakdown of law and order in this country.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London,
Trump rally in front of the American Embassy,
bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles, and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
America, the last best hope for democracy. That's the title of a compelling article on LibertyNation.com this week by managing editor and international correspondent Mark Angelides, following close on the heels of another piece he wrote entitled Riots and Executions, Who's Really to Blame? So, with President Trump unleashing a full-on verbal assault on the Democrats for allowing riots and destruction to continue almost unabated, and Joe Biden now finally speaking out after he and his party let the riots continue for months and said nothing about it at their own convention, but now blaming Trump for the insurrection, it's time for some perspective, including a view of how the world is perceiving this seeming meltdown in a nation that's always been counted on as a sea of stability in an unstable world. And so we turn to our man on the ground in England, Mark Angelides. Welcome back, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure as always. So, among other things, you're one of LibertyNation.com's polling mavens. What metrics do we have at this point to show how Americans are evaluating the competing claims by Trump and Biden about the cause of all this civil unrest?
Well, we actually have some pretty interesting data on this one. There's latest polling coming out today, actually, that but I think it's by a margin of 2%. Voters trust Joe Biden more on public safety. And that's a big catch-all. Obviously, it covers the things like the riots and stuff, but it also covers many other things, including parts of healthcare. However, and here's the rub of it. A majority say that the country is less divided now than when Obama left office.
Really?
And that also, yeah. And that also if Trump loses, that the division within the country will get worse than it is right now. So it's it almost seems contradictory. Mm-hmm. But to me, this suggests that a lot of voters, they see the Democrats as a party as quite divisive.
So it's fascinating that Democrats are laying such a hate on America when millions of people are still trying to come here from around the world, the kind of people they want to let in, and Trump is placing them some restrictions on. Is America still viewed as the beacon of liberty it used to be? And how do you think that's changed in the worldview during a time of violence that we haven't seen in 50 years here?
Well, I think, Tim, the answer is yes. It's still viewed as a beacon of liberty. And in fact, one of the last ones. I mean, you have to take the international perspective on things. I think that's something that, those of us who work in the US media, we don't really pay a lot of attention to. I mean, if you think things are bad in America, you really got to look to the rest of the world. For example, if you look at New Zealand, the rights are really being trampled there. It's almost like the perfect ideal of a leftist bastion with the COVID things, for example, is you can be taken from your home forcibly and put into, they call it containment facilities or internment camps, as I like to call them. And the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she was doing a live stream chat where she was answering questions. And she said that, well, a question I've been asked is, what happens if people refuse the tests? And she says, well, you can't. So what will happen is, if you refuse to take the test, we'll keep you there for another 2 weeks. This is indefinite imprisonment against your will. And that's happening in what's regarded as one of the bright lights of the left in the globalist world. And of course, Australia. Just yesterday, there was a mother of two, well, she was pregnant, so soon to be 3, who was arrested in her home. And her husband recorded all this. Arrested in her home, and all of the electronic devices within her home seized. And her crime was she shared a post about an anti-lockdown protest. Now, that post was very specific, that we must observe social distancing, wear a face mask if possible. But she was arrested in front of her children, and all of her electronic devices seized in Australia. The freedoms that we thought were universal among, let's say, the Anglophile countries, they're not there anymore. It's really, tyranny is rampant all over the world. So I think for everybody in the entire world looking at America, it really is the last shining hope of a return to freedoms.
Let's talk about some more recent events, specific events. You write about Trump saying dark, unseen forces are behind this insurrection. When he talked about a plane loaded with thugs wearing dark uniforms, black uniforms, headed somewhere to foment violence. Is there anything to date backing up the president's claim?
Well, yeah, sure. There's, I mean, we look at the arrest stats for all these cities and states that are having problems, and a large proportion of these people are out of staters. So they're clearly traveling into the state. People are moving around. Black Lives Matter has received, I believe it's estimated around $1 billion since 2016. And a lot of that is from some very big, very well-known foundations, ones that would be instantly recognizable to our listeners. And they have these huge, shiny black buses to travel around in. Now, somebody's paying for that. But I think the biggest tell is that you have politicians and media who refuse to name and condemn the violence from these groups. It's almost like they're afraid to. Jerry Nadler even called Antifa violence. He called it a myth. And you know these people are violent. They've got their uniforms. They've got their shields with Antifa logos on, and they're hitting people and they're beating people. But nobody's willing to name them. It's almost like Voldemort from Harry Potter. Dare not say the name, which suggests power. It suggests support from places on high. So, yes, I would say that Donald Trump is exactly right. These, obviously, not everybody's involved in the higher up stuff, but there's certainly a lot of power and influence supporting these groups.
Now, are Democrats who've refused to acknowledge the violence, or hardly so, going to be forced to finally admit the existence of Antifa and condemn them and all, or mostly white domestic terrorist organization at their root, and distance themselves from Black Lives Matter now that public support for BLM is starting to crater?
Well, they haven't so far. I'd say that's the most telling indicator. You had a CNN interview with, I believe it was Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo. And they were discussing among themselves how this is starting to show in the polls. Obviously, these are not polls that you and I are privy to, apparently, but the BLM and Antifa issue is starting to show in polls. Clearly, they're doing some internal polling, and that now Biden needs to start addressing this. Yet he failed to. He hasn't yet. He's condemned the violence, but he hasn't said who the violence is coming from. They're still running with the, as you say, the white nationalist theme, or the Trump supporter theme, which is demonstrably false. I mean, if you look at the media coverage, for example, of the Kyle Rittenhouse event there in Kenosha, how many news outlets have shown the video footage? It's there. We can all watch it on social media.
But what they've done is they show just the part where Rittenhouse is doing the shooting.
I mean, more than that, they don't show the part. They talk about the third person who was shot, but they don't show the part with him raising a gun towards Rittenhouse's head while Rittenhouse is lying on the floor. And of course, they also don't show the social media post that the third guy who was shot in the arm and his buddy put out the day after, where the man who was shot said, "I wish I'd drawn my gun quicker so I could kill him." They're not showing this, and it's there. And there's a reason for that. It's because they're pushing a narrative, and they want to control the narrative. And that narrative will be blown apart if they actually show the footage. So yeah, it's. I think it's the media that really has to force the hand of the politicians. If the media were willing to show these videos, then the truth would be out there, and the politicians would have, for example, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they'd have almost no choice but to say, yes, we condemn Antifa violence, we condemn Black Lives Matter violence. But until the media actually make it an impossible situation, then they'll continue to back these groups implicitly.
Well stated, as always. Thank you, Mark.
Pleasure.
Mark Angelides, LibertyNation.com. Stay right there because we're coming back with Talkin Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now at a time where individual liberty is as threatened as any time we can remember in recent history, we come to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin Liberty, protecting and identifying threats to your individual liberty, as we're joined by who else? LibertyNation.com's legal affairs editor, constitutional lawyer, and the man that we prefer to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Well, I certainly prefer it too. Hello. I've tried to get the DMV to print out on my driver's license, but not just yet anyway.
Okay, we're working on it. You got special connections. We don't want to reveal what they are. But let's go straight to the Third Circuit of the federal courts okaying a high-capacity magazine ban.
Tim, Judge Kent Jordan wrote the decision. You know, my history with the Third Circuit runs deep. I attended law school within the Third Circuit, and that's the federal courts that sort of are closest to me. And New Jersey, of course, is a state I'm a refugee from because of their gun laws, and they always try to ratchet them down. This is a 10-round mag ban, calling any magazine that holds 10 rounds or more large capacity mags and banning them. Tim, it's important for me to hastenly add that just last month, the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned California's magazine ban. Now, we've got, the Supreme Court has refused to take these gun cases. We've talked about it again and again, that we have splits in the circuits and federal courts deciding things differently. So citizens in one part of the country are subject to different laws federally than citizens in other parts of the country. It's an untenable existence. And I think that this is just another kind of maybe the straw that breaks the camel's back on the Supreme Court finally needing to take Second Amendment cases to establish once and for all a national standard for our federal laws.
All right, let's move on to the Centers for Disease Control, which have, of course, exercised a great deal of power during this COVID crisis, and the CDC's eviction moratorium is threatening landlords with $100,000 fines and a year in jail for noncompliance.
Well, it seems to me, Tim, like they conjured the power out of the air, which is why I bring it to the table for us to talk about for any eviction that they make. If any tenant of theirs who makes up to $200,000 a year for joint filers, they can't be evicted for failure to pay rent. It is a staggering imposition, Tim, on the country's landlords, many of whom are not, giant global not that those corporations shouldn't be able to make a buck too, but there are also many people who depend on rental income for a non-lavish lifestyle. And I think that if you asked any American, did the CDC have the power to do this, 6 months ago, everybody would say no. Well, there is no new law in force that allows them to. The previous payout and combined with eviction restrictions has expired. So without new legislation, they've just done it. And it seems like a massive power grab, Tim.
So let's go to Kenosha next, because the president was there, which stirred up, as always with Trump, a great deal of controversy. Joe Biden is headed there a couple days after Trump. But you've done an awful lot of analysis of the shootings in question, the things that have stoked all the violence in Kenosha. So give us that analysis of these shootings that we hear so much about, but almost randomly through TV and news reports.
Tim, Jacob Blake was shot by Kenosha police officers. It has been misreported that he was unarmed. He was shot in the back, but that has to do more with the body mechanics of how he was moving at the time of the shooting. We have every reason to believe, in terms of the evidence that's presented, that he was violently resisting arrest and at least had one weapon, and alleged that he may have had a firearm in the vehicle that he was entering. So while I don't know that any or all of the 7 shots that were lodged into the man were justifiably shot, the idea that it was just some act of racist violence for no reason is not supported by any of the facts and evidence. Then we have the Kyle Rittenhouse shootings. Rittenhouse was involved in the protests. He's a 17-year-old who's currently being prosecuted for first-degree murder, among other very serious crimes. He shot 3 people, killing 2. He missed a 4th person he shot at. And I have a detailed self-defense analysis of all those shootings on LibertyNation.com. And my analysis, Tim, is that Rittenhouse has a classic self-defense justification for each and every one of those shootings. And I can find no evidence where the DA has provided any, forget about evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, but even probable cause that Mr. Rittenhouse committed murder, and first-degree murder at that.
I'm wondering, Scott, in all this, whether the facts even matter anymore, because all of these shootings stoke a narrative on one side of the political aisle.
Tim, I think it's very important that we keep judges out of the political process as much as possible, because we know that prosecutors who are deeply involved in the political process cannot be trusted on the left or the right to be neutral.
Well, let's get out of violence and COVID and into something that, well, it's not a whole lot better, but at least it's a different subject. The state of Washington, where Attorney General Bob Ferguson has sued the big-time vape company known as Juul. Why?
Well, let's say that for my I'm laughing because, you know, the real reason why I believe is because it gives him power to do so. That goes back to the prosecutor discussion, right? Which is he's a politician. He says that it's because they used bright colors and candy flavored vaping juice along with young models to entice young people to use their products. Now, if you said, Tim, well, gee, even products that are designed specifically for seniors use younger models, bright colors, and candy flavors to sell whatever products they may be after, I would say, yes, of course they do. And there's no way that Juul could get pre-clearance for its advertising. It's not like there's some magic list where you can say, all right, if I use these things, am I going to be sure to not run afoul of the law? It is, to me, a absolute imposition on the Juul companies, right, to just engage in legal advertising for their product, Tim.
It's interesting, Scott, that in Washington state, marijuana's legal and so are nicotine vapes, and yet they're going after the nicotine vapes and not so much after the weed. Interesting choice. And let's conclude by talking or providing an update about the Michael Flynn case.
Well, it's a short update, Tim. The case was before en banc review at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and Judge Emmett Sullivan won, which is to say that the Michael Flynn team was hoping to have Judge Sullivan removed and a new judge appointed and directed to dismiss the criminal charges against Mr. Flynn. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the case should stay with Judge Sullivan, at least for the time being. They didn't rule on the substantive matters before the court, much as to say that the remedies the remedies that Michael Flynn has were still available, even if Judge Sullivan didn't do his job further down the line. So the ball is back in Judge Sullivan's court. He can either do the right thing or not, and Michael Flynn will once again then be forced, Tim, to appeal the decision.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Tim.
Scott Cosenza, ladies and gentlemen, and this program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with our own Mark Angelides, who you also heard earlier in this program. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, now more than ever, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.